Hello, everyone, and welcome to the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. I'm Ralph Russo, the college football writer with the Associated Press. If you really love college football, all of college football, well, at least all of major college football, this could be the best week of the year, at least so far. All of the FBS conferences will have games this weekend. The MAC plays its first games all on Wednesday night, kicking off a 4-day football feast. It's almost like opening weekend all over again. The Pac-12 gets it going this weekend with Arizona State at USC and Stanford at Oregon, and there are 4 games matching ranked teams, including 2 top 10 matchups, Florida, Georgia, and Clemson, Notre Dame. To preview it all and talk about where the rest of this season is headed, I bring in my friend Stewart Mandel of The Athletic. We'll preview the games and we'll talk about them in the backdrop of the college football playoff, because even though we have conferences that are just starting, we're getting to the point when we probably need to start talking about what the playoff race looks like. It's been a while since I've had a chance to talk with Stu on this show. Figured now is the perfect time. One behind the curtain piece of information you need to know, because there is another significant news event on Tuesday. Maybe you've heard, but there's a presidential election. I'm recording this podcast a little earlier than usual. We're getting it done Monday evening. So while we're mostly doing a forward-looking show to a great weekend of games, there might be some news we miss. Specifically, whether Wisconsin will be able to play a game against Purdue this weekend after a COVID-19 outbreak forced the Badgers to cancel last week. That news was supposed to be coming Tuesday, so if you're not hearing us talk about that or anything else that maybe pops up between now and the weekend, that is why. We're recording Monday evening and doing a preview of a great weekend of college football. Thanks for listening to the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. You can find us on Westwood One Podcast, Apple Podcasts, just about anywhere you like to get your podcast. If you like what you hear, give us a rating and a good review. It helps college football fans find us, and it helps us find more college football fans, and away we go. Joining me this week on the podcast is my good friend Stewart Mandel from The Athletic. It has been a little while since I've had you on, Stu, to put the pre-show talk on air. You know, everybody's got a podcast these days, so you find myself thinking like, well, you know, should I have Stu on? He's already got his own show like 2 or 3 times a week. I think you're doing your thing with Bruce. So first of all, welcome back. Secondly, go promote your show with Bruce right now, and do any other kind of promotions you might need before we get into what's going to be an awesome week of football.
Well, thanks, Ralph. Yes, the Audible. Bruce and I do the Audible, available wherever you got this podcast. We do it twice a week, in season, Sunday and Thursday. And of course, if you haven't already, you should subscribe to The Athletic and read our stories. Yeah,
The Athletic is great stuff, and Stu is the boss at The Athletic, college football. So,
I'll take it. Okay, college football. Yeah, I'm editor-in-chief of college football. I have on my LinkedIn profile, it says editor-in-chief, and I get all of these random emails from people who think I run the entire company. And
yes.
You're like, sorry, I don't have any idea what you're talking about. But yes.
So the cool thing about this week, and I'm going to mention this again, I did it in the opening, but some people sometimes skip the opening. We are recording this a little earlier than I usually record my podcast. I tend to do it on Tuesdays. It is Monday evening. Partially was because of Stu's schedule, and partially because there's a presidential election tomorrow, and I think I just kind of wanted to clear decks. You know, I just, like a lot of things, I think the AP just sort of kind of wants to get everything out of the way so we can just sort of concentrate on the election tomorrow. So we are.
Now, are you one of the 4,000 AP reporters that calls and tabulates the results to make the projection?
Goodness, no.
They're the ones that call who won.
Yeah, we do. And I have some of my editors. Like, you have to be a fairly high level I shouldn't say that. Like, I guess I could, because I do know some sports writers who do that, who are taught how to do the calling of elections. I've never really wanted to do that. I've certainly worked election nights for AP in a news capacity when a long time ago in a galaxy far away. But no, I am not a caller of elections, though several of my bosses and, again, some of my my colleagues on the sports side are doing that. So no, that's not me. Okay. I will be.
Well, the reason I asked, and sorry if I'm sidetracking.
No, that's okay. That's okay.
You already have experience. You compile a poll every week, having to gather a bunch of people's votes. And it's a poll that, the results of which usually incite a lot of emotion among people. So I didn't know if they maybe called on you because of that.
The funny thing is, and then I promise we will get off the tangent, listeners, but this might be a somewhat interesting tangent. Obviously, the AP college football poll is a poll, or we call it a poll, though I imagine there are people within the AP who are more situated with news polling, scientific polling for elections and things along those lines, who I know probably cringe at the mere idea that we identify the college football poll as a poll, because it's not a scientific poll. AP polls, whether, opinion polls, surveys, things along those lines, there's a scientific element to that as far as gathering, picking a random sample of people, how many you come up with. Like there's polling is an intricate thing. Picking 65 people from around the country, 62 people from around the country, using, sort of a common sense kind of logic to cover the voters, to cover the country in a way that covers college football. There's really nothing particularly scientific about that. So no, the AP college football poll has nothing similar with calling elections or doing that type of polling.
I hadn't thought about that before. It's almost like we need a new phrase in our lexicon, because that word gets used interchangeably for, like you said, a very scientific survey that people go out and companies are paid a lot of money to do. And, on any given day on Twitter, somebody's doing a poll about favorite ice cream toppings and whatnot. Right. So,
yeah, well, but the AP college football poll has been around since 1936. We were here first, so we get to claim it. Like, we're not changing. We're not changing for the rest of the company. Speaking of the AP college football poll, it's a very close vote this week between Clemson and Alabama, almost a tie. Clemson was 2 points ahead of Alabama. Clemson goes into, let's just start at the top. Let's start the best game of the week. We're going to kind of preview the weekend, maybe not do completely game by game. We'll go off on some tangents here. I also want to tie in some playoff discussion, because we're at that time where we can start talking about the playoff, even though the Pac-12 hasn't even started playing, so that's weird. But let's start at the top with Notre Dame and Clemson. The amazing thing to me is, going into this game, Clemson is starting its second string freshman quarterback. And Stu, if I asked you which team, and Notre Dame is starting a 3-year starter, 5th-year senior. And if going to this game, I asked you, Stewart Mandel, who has the edge at starting quarterback, Clemson or Notre Dame?
Oh, wow. What a curveball. We've seen DJ for one game, but he looked pretty darn good. And so I think Clemson would have the edge at quarterback. And I'm not saying that out of disrespect to Ian Book. They're not playing with the same – he's not playing with the same receivers. So – you never know exactly with Clemson. Did he play that well because he's such a great quarterback, or because he gets to throw the ball to Amari Rodgers, Travis Etienne, and Cornell Powell? I mean, that's the thing with Notre Dame this year. Great running game, great defense, great offensive line, not a Chase Claypool or they've had some great receivers come through there under Brian Kelly. Miles Boykin before him. They don't have anybody like that for Ian Book to throw to.
Yeah, and I also think that, DJ Ungalele is a special talent. Yeah, and that's a player who is probably starting at, well, I wrote last week in the column I wrote on Saturday, conservatively speaking, DJ Ungalele would start at 75% of Power 5 schools right now. Like, if you get now, again, we're not going to go through each one, but And I might even include Notre Dame, quite frankly. He is a special talent. And unfortunately, one of the things Notre Dame has been missing, and we can sort of bounce off that, because you said that they're missing the receivers. I think there's a lot of discussion around why can't Notre Dame beat top 5 teams, right? They're 0-5 under Kelly against top 5 teams. Their last victory against a top 5 team, I believe, was the Florida State win back in '93. But I think part of the reason—
It was actually, believe it or not, a Michigan State game in Charlie Weiss's first season.
Oh, really? Okay. So they did have one.
That was the last win over a top 5 team.
Was that a game that Michigan State had a whole bunch of defensive holding and pass interference calls?
All I know is Michigan State didn't finish that season anywhere near the top 5. I don't, off the top of my head, remember why they would have been ranked that high. Was that a Drew Stanton team?
It might have been. Yeah. So you mentioned the wide receivers, but I think the biggest difference that, what has sort of kept Notre Dame out of the elite of elite conversation and why they've had a hard time beating the Ohio States and the really good Georgia teams and things like that is it's not just wide receivers. It's sort of like skill positions in general and just not having enough like sort of special explosive players. They haven't had a great quarterback at Notre Dame. I mean, Brady Quinn's probably the closest thing to a great quarterback at Notre Dame. He was a first round draft pick and a very good college player. They've had some good quarterbacks under Kelly. Even at running back, they've had some good players, but like the type of difference making players at skill positions that you see at elite schools have just simply not been at Notre Dame. And so that's why I don't think things are going to be that much different on Saturday, because Clemson has a number 2 quarterback who is a difference making level of talent. First
of all, let me correct myself. It was a number 3 Michigan team that they beat in 2005. They then lost to Michigan State. So I'm sure there's Notre Dame fans listening to this that were like, he's wrong. So
I appreciate you correcting the record.
You're right. If you think about it, there's another big game Saturday. I'm sure we're going to talk about, Florida, Georgia, and they both have kind of a similar feel where you've got one team that is college football in 2020, which is great quarterback, great receivers, or in Florida's case, tight end, and we're going to go out and we're going to outscore you. And then Georgia under Kirby Smart, even more so than Brian Kelly under Notre Dame, is going to try to beat you the old-fashioned way. Just don't make mistakes on offense, run the ball, and we'll play good defense. And up until, I don't know, not that long ago, I would have said, I want the team with the strong defense. But that just doesn't seem to be the formula right now in college football. LSU certainly showed that last year. Alabama is that team right now. And Clemson, certainly with Trevor Lawrence, but I also think with DJ, is that kind of team. Clemson being the rare team that also can have a world beater offense and also be extremely dominant on defense, though they were not against Boston College. But yeah, I mean, Notre Dame hasn't had its own Deshaun Watson, Trevor Lawrence, Tua in a long, long time.
And I think that'll be the thing that breaks Notre Dame through event. People ask, like, we have this conversation, right? Can Notre Dame win a national championship still? And I think Brian Kelly is showing that, I mean, if you're this close, the answer is probably yes, though that last step is the toughest and maybe biggest step to take. But I think where you can bridge the gap, because you're never going to have as many 5 stars as Ohio State, Alabama, maybe not even Clemson. But if you have that one very special quarterback and you have enough 4s and 5 stars, that can bridge the gap. I don't know if that kid's in the pipeline. I don't think so. I haven't seen, I know they're always going to have a good 4-star recruit come in, but I think that's going to be the thing that separates. Again, I think my guess is it'll end up being the separator on Saturday as well. You brought up Georgia, Florida. And like Stu, at this point, I think Georgia's trying to win the 2011 national championship. I don't.
Ouch.
I just don't know if you. I think Georgia is the better team here, and because Florida's defense is so shaky, that it will lift Georgia's offense up. But I don't know if it will lift it up enough to keep up with Florida, especially now that Georgia's kind of banged up on defense. And, just also hopefully Richard LeCounte is going to be okay. Yeah, it sounds like he's out of ICU, but the really great Georgia safety was in a motorcycle accident. And again, the signs are encouraging, but he could be out a while. Again, hopefully just for his own sake, he's okay. But they've got other injuries on that defense. Again, normally I would say the bad defense will lift up the not as good offense and Georgia will be okay. But now I'm not so sure.
Well, Georgia is the poster right now for, he had the quarterback. He had Justin Fields. He had him there and let him get away. And I don't go back and revisit that decision. It seemed like the right decision at the time. But ever since, they've just been chasing that. And so, if you were to go and look at, if you had an NFL scout come in and tell you about Georgia's roster and Florida's roster, he would tell you Georgia is more talented at almost every position on the field. But then you've got Kyle Trask, who I don't know what he's projected now. He's starting to get first round talk maybe, versus Stetson Bennett. It's just a complete mismatch, and that goes a long way in a game like this.
Yeah, because I can see Florida just making a bunch of big plays and Georgia having a hard time keeping up. And by the way, I still do relitigate. The Fields thing. I think Kirby Smart. You just can't let a player that good get away. I totally understand.
At the time, you don't know that he's going to become that. I mean, he's got
everybody
5-star ranking. Don't you think if he was that good as a freshman, like they saw him every day in practice, if he was that good as a freshman, wouldn't he have played more that season? Jake Fromm was good that season, but it wasn't like you could never take him off the field.
I felt like if you have a player the level of Fields, you gotta remember Fields and Trevor Lawrence that year, because he wasn't just a 5-star Fields, and being a 5-star is probably enough. He wasn't just a 5. Fields and Lawrence that year were sort of considered 1 and 1A. So my feeling is such that even if you don't play him, even if you're not starting him that year, you have to figure out how to keep him. And you also may have to consider, okay, how do I get the best out of this? Like maybe I need to remake my offense so it's more suited to Justin Fields than to Jake Fromm. And Georgia fans, I'm sure, will kill me. And Fromm was a really good player, especially that particular year. Fromm regressed his senior year, or his junior year, but was still very good in his sophomore year. I don't know if it's really necessary to relitigate all this, but I still think that it is a failure on the part of, again, I'm not saying Kirby needs to be fired because of it, but I think it is a failure on the part of Georgia and Kirby Smart and that staff that they had Justin Fields and did not say, we have to figure out a way to build our offense around this guy. We have to make him comfortable because this is a this is a program changing player. This is the guy who can beat Alabama. This is the type of player who beats Alabama.
Well, now you've convinced me. But probably more so on the part about, Kirby Smart, for somebody who has built his whole program, based on wanting to be Alabama, wanting to do it the way Alabama does. He just seems to me that he's unable to or unwilling to do what he needs to do with that system on offense. Todd Monken was going to be the guy that would come in and revolutionize it, and it looks the same to me. With some subtle changes.
Do you think maybe, and we don't know this for sure, but so I don't know if I'm asking you to speculate. Do you think that would have been different if it was a normal off season and maybe Jamie Newman was still there?
Well, that's the thing, right? Jamie Newman was supposed to be the answer there. And then people thought JT Daniels was the answer, not realizing that he was still so far behind with his health. So how much of it is the scheme and how much of it is that they can't do everything they want to do on offense because they've decided that Bennett is their best answer at quarterback, and he got off to a hot start. But after his last 2 games, I don't know how you could say that's a quarterback who's going to lead you to the national championship. So, and the other thing is, it's not he wants to run the ball and pound the ball, and that's great when you have Nick Chubb and Sony Michel. But it's they're not putting up amazing numbers running the ball either.
They have good running backs. White is a good player. Maybe there's potential for those guys to be even better. But you're right. If you start comparing them to Chubb, like they're not getting Chubb, Michelle, even DeAndre Swift level of production from those running backs, even though they're very good. Now they're also dealing with, and again, it's hard to, you don't want to cut Georgia too much slack. They also have a very much a rebuilt offensive line. Now, all the guys who are playing on that rebuilt offensive line, everybody in the country would want those players and probably be starting them. But it is fair to say, like, maybe next year, Georgia will have the monster offensive line. And this year, you know, even as good as the talent is, you still got to give these guys a little room to grow. But there's all kinds of issues there, and I do think they started quarterback. Let's talk about the playoff with these two games and playoff implications. And again, it's weird to talk playoff implications when one Power 5 conference league has not kicked off yet, but such is 2020. My feeling is Notre Dame, even beating the backup, could play its way into the playoff by beating Clemson here. That doesn't necessarily, like, if Notre Dame were to split against Clemson, beat the backup quarterback, and then lose to the starting quarterback, assuming Trevor comes back and everything's cool, in the ACC championship game, that could be enough to get Notre Dame into a playoff.
Yeah, especially when, at this point, I'm under the assumption there will not be a realistic contender coming from the Big 12. I personally don't believe a Pac-12 team can get in. Some people disagree. Oh, Oregon goes out, looks great, 7-0, beats there's still 7 games, right? Notre Dame's going to end up, if they make the ACC championship, playing 12. So it's interesting because I think what it means is that Notre Dame Clemson is the bigger game in terms of appeal and curiosity. But
Florida, 1 versus 4.
Yeah, Florida 1 versus 4. But in the system we have, Florida Georgia has higher stakes because it's an elimination game. That is a loser go home game in terms of getting to Atlanta and getting a chance to play your way into the playoff. Clemson Notre Dame to me feels like whoever loses might have a mulligan, especially if it's Clemson playing without Trevor Lawrence, because that is that exact scenario has already happened in the playoff era. I'll never forget going on those committee calls, I'm sure you do every week too, the year that Clemson lost at Syracuse and Kelly Bryant got knocked out. Mm-hmm. And the way they would talk about it, it was as if Kelly Bryant was Peyton Manning. Well, we can't hold that against them. They lost their quarterback. So you can imagine how much they'll forgive them if they lose without Trevor Lawrence.
Which I think is fair to a certain degree. But I guess you're in this weird position, right? Like, I'm playing both sides. DJ is good enough so that if you beat Clemson with DJ, that's a good win, and that should be able to help vault you into serious playoff contention. But he is not good enough to replace Lawrence to the extent that you would hold it against Clemson for losing to Notre Dame, and then coming back with a mulligan and winning later on. Now, but the other thing too, Stu, is, I mean, we've seen this all the time. Everybody kind of gets one mulligan, especially when you're at Clemson's level. So I don't think that, like, losing one regular, like, yeah, I think even if they would have lost to BC, they could have wiped all that out by beating Notre Dame and just going about and winning all the rest of their games. We talk this. It hasn't happened this year yet because we haven't had enough games. But every year we go through somebody loses a game they're not supposed to. Everybody jumps on Twitter and says, "Oh, they must be out of it. They lost to a 4-win team or a 3-win team or this amount of win team." And you're kind of like, okay, let's go through all the teams that have lost to teams that barely finished 500 and still made the playoff. But I do think it's a weird situation where, again, I'm thinking as highly enough of Ungalele that I think that Notre Dame beating him is a big deal, but not so much so that I wouldn't also give Clemson a little bit of a mulligan because they don't have Trevor.
Oh, Notre Dame winning will be it's a thing where Notre Dame will get full credit for beating the number 1 team in the country, a team that hasn't lost a regular season game in 3 years, right? So it's a big deal to beat Clemson, whoever the quarterback is. But I also think Clemson will get like, you know, a prorated a prorated factor on its loss. Now, to your point, generally speaking, it's better to lose. If you're going to lose, it's actually better, and it's a strange thing, but it's true. It's better to lose to somebody bad because you don't want to miss out on. I mean, Notre Dame's not going to get many chances to beat a highly ranked team, nor will Clemson. And you want to, in a normal year, you want to be able to get to the end of the year and say they have 3 top 25 wins or 4 top 25 wins. Yeah, they lost to this 5-7 team, but look at all these great wins. And the reason I don't necessarily think that'll be the case this year is because it's a shortened season and not many teams are even going to get to play that many top. Like, I don't think at the end of the day, the 4th playoff spot's going to come down to somebody who had 3 top 25 wins versus somebody who had 2, because I just don't think many teams are going to get to play that many games.
Yeah, in some ways, it's better to lose to the team that's sort of out of the contention in your conference, because you don't have to worry about tiebreakers with that team and that one loss squeezing you out of a conference championship game. I think back to like when Ohio State had its one loss year. And it's when the really good
2015,
the 2015 team, right? It only loses one game, but it loses the game to Michigan State that keeps them out of the Big Ten championship game and essentially keeps them out of the playoff when clearly they were the best team in the Big Ten that year.
Yeah, I remember that very well. That was kind of a great lesson in that, because Ohio State, and that was such a talented team, but they just for whatever reason didn't end up beating a top 25 team till Michigan in the last game of the season.
They had a little bit of a weaker schedule. Yeah. A lot of the way the Big Ten schedule fell that year, they had a little bit of a weaker schedule and they kind of futzed around, and they only had 2 games that they really needed to win, and they lost one of them.
They did. And then that same year, Michigan State beats them and knocks them out of the title game. Michigan State lost to a 5-7 Nebraska team that year.
Yeah.
But they won the Big Ten. They went to the playoff. Oklahoma lost to a 5-7 Texas team, but won the Big 12 and went to the playoff. So the lesson there was, if you're going to lose to the 5-7 team, not the team that you're contending for the division title with. Okay,
I want to take a quick break, and then we're going to come back with Stewart Mandel from The Athletic and talk. We're going to shift our focus to some other games. I'm going to start with the Pac-12, Stu, your home conference, and because they're starting their season, and there's some interesting games there, even though they're not the ranked. There's a couple of ranked teams involved, but they're not the ranked versus ranked matchups. You're listening to the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. We'll be back right after this.
Hey, it's Michael Rosenbaum. You may remember me as Lex Luthor from the hit TV show Smallville. Regardless, I have this really cool podcast called Inside of You with Michael Rosenbaum, where I get celebrities who are a lot more famous than me to really open up. Let's get inside of Jim Jeffries.
Oh, I never did anything with my life. I could have been a better son. Oh, God. I should apologize to this person.
So, join me on Inside of You with Michael Rosenbaum. New episodes drop every Tuesday. Listen on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your shows.
All right, so back with Stewart Mandel from The Athletic on the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. We talked about the big games. There's some other pretty interesting ones, but I do want to get to the Pac-12 and the 9 a.m. local time kickoff for USC and Arizona State. I love the way the Pac-12 schedule really does set up on this opening weekend. There are some very intriguing matchups and big games with, I think USC and Arizona State are probably the best 2 teams in the South. Utah fans will argue with that. And there's Oregon is probably the best team in the North. And if you don't like Oregon, maybe you'll like Stanford to bounce back. And if you don't like either of those 2 teams, well, Cal and Washington are also playing on Saturday night. So that should be a pretty interesting race. You mentioned you don't think the Pac-12 can get in simply because it's 7 games. That's a fair assessment. I think the Pac-12 won't get in simply because I don't see a team that's going to be able to get through it undefeated. I'm a little puzzled by all the love still being thrown at Oregon, not just because of all the departures in the offseason, but now with the opt-outs. I just so much uncertainty with Oregon.
Well, first of all, on the playoff thing, the biggest thing working against Pac-12 is the perception that conference already has. They're going into it from the disadvantage of, oh, that's the conference that hasn't had a playoff team in 4 years. So if this had happened to the SEC, but Alabama only played 7 games, I wouldn't be saying the same thing. It's going to be harder for these teams to prove that they are at that elite level because the Pac-12 hasn't had an elite team like that in a long time. And they're not playing out of conference to, in the original schedule, Oregon would have had the chance to beat Ohio State and USC would have had the chance to play Alabama. And some will say that it's probably a good thing that they didn't, but theoretically that was their big chance. Yes, I agree with you about Oregon. I agree. I just think the Pac-12, if there's any conference that has a chance to just produce the most random champion that you could possibly think of, it's this one. You're playing 7 games. Think about all the teams over the years that started 6-1 and then lost 4 of their last 5, right? Like you don't have to deal with it. It's just whoever you start out hot and then the season's over. And then the Pac-12 teams have just had to deal with things that other parts of the country just didn't have to deal with. Stanford when training camp opened, they couldn't practice at their own practice field. They had to go to a high school because of the restrictions. And the UCLA players, Dorian Thompson-Robinson couldn't throw a football to his receivers until like 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago. So I think who can forecast the effect that has on some of these teams? Maybe it will cause teams to be worse than you thought they would be. Maybe it'll have no effect. And then with the opt-outs, some of these teams aren't going to be the team that you were expecting to see back at the time that the Athlon magazines came out.
I also, another part of this that will be interesting because it's USC and USC is always interesting. This was supposed to be, okay, Clay, let me see what you can do, right? I mean, we've gone through this dance with Clay Helton and whether he's going to remain the coach. Last year, everybody practically had him out the door, and USC said, you know what? I think we're going to get the rest of our house in order first, and then we'll try to put a better assessment of the head coach. So that was the route they went. We're going to get him a better recruiting department. We're going to get him better assistants. We're going to build everything up around him and see if he can do it. And if he can't, then we'll be in position to go hard into the market and get a really big coach. Then a pandemic hits. Do you have any sense if we are still in Clay referendum mode at USC? In other words, if USC goes, again, they're only going to play 7 games. If they go 4-3, do they keep the same plan and say, okay, Clay, not good enough, we're moving on? Like, I've heard that they might, if it gets real, that there's going to be a little pandemic cushion, but that if it goes awry, they might still stick to the plan and say, nope, you didn't get it done, and we're going to try to we're going to build off of what we have built around you, but just with somebody better than you.
First of all, I think things couldn't have lined up better for Clay Helton because of all this. He doesn't have to play any non-conference games. That's really, the biggest source of why USC fans have no confidence in him is all of the meltdowns they've had against Notre Dame, Alabama, Ohio State in a bowl game. Like, they've actually done pretty well in conference, except for that 1-5-7 season. So yeah, I think it's hard to judge anybody, right? I mean, I said this, I was on an LA radio station. They asked me about this. I said, I think you can only really truly judge him if it's extreme one way or the other. If you go 7-0, great. We're going to invest in Clay Helton for the long term. If he goes 2-5, I think he's done. But with your scenario of 4-3, like, what does that even mean? I don't know. I don't want to call it an exhibition season, but it just doesn't feel like a real season that they're going to be playing. So, if that's what causes him to go, then that tells me that Mike Bohn already has his mind made up and was just biding his time waiting to do it, right? Mm-hmm. I don't know what you would actually learn from a 4-3 season that would tell you, you know what, I thought he was our guy before, but now I don't.
So, okay, so I'm not going to, well, maybe I should. I guess I have to ask you to predict who you think is going to come out, especially again, because you live in California. So I assume you might have a little more sense of what goes on out there. Do you have any sense of who is going to win this conference? Or if I made you pick and not holding you to it, who do you think would win this conference?
Yeah, I'm high on USC, to be honest. Obviously they've got the most proven quarterback. They did fairly well. I mean, they had a couple opt-outs, but it wasn't quite as significant as Oregon's or some of the other teams. And it just seems like it's they've just got like a good veteran group there. I mean, they were the team that sent the letter to Gavin Newsom that helped get the Pac-12 back on board. There's good leadership there. So that's the team I have the most confidence in, which is crazy to say, I'm sure, to some people because of the uncertainty about Clay Helton. I think the rest of their division is pretty suspect. I'm not sure what happens in the North. Is Oregon still the best team? Possibly. Prior to the pandemic, I was very, very high on Cal and how this could be Cal's year. They had to deal with all kinds of crazy restrictions and they lost some key guys to opt out. So, like I said before, you could tell me just by Colorado, I wouldn't believe. Arizona, I wouldn't believe. Probably not Washington State, but almost anybody else, you could talk me into this team is going to emerge from a 7-game season.
Okay, maybe the best game of the weekend because of its oddness and because of the interesting stakes, because you're really not sure what the stakes are, is Friday night. Yep. BYU at Boise State. Now, we've seen Boise State play 2 games, one with a backup quarterback in Jack Sears, by the way, USC transfer. Boise is not saying what's going on with Hank Bachmeier, but listen, if you don't travel with the team and you're out and they don't give you any idea of what's going on, when there's a pandemic, feel free to speculate that Hank Bachmeier is out with the possibility of this virus, right? Now, so we don't know if he plays on Friday. But Jack Sears, again, did a good job, and the kid did go to USC, so maybe they have something there. This will be a much tougher test than they had last week at Air Force. Let's also talk about this game within sort of the scope of the playoff, because BYU is number 9 in the AP poll. We have talked about how it's going to be really hard for the Pac-12, going to be really hard for the Big 12. Goodness knows, we're not going to go too deep into the Big 12. I mean, I guess there's still a scenario here where Oklahoma State wins out. I don't think that's going to happen. I think the Big 12 is just going to completely collapse on itself. I wouldn't be surprised at all if Oklahoma managed to figure out a way to get into the Big 12 title game. It's going to be tough with the tiebreakers, but if they do, I could see them winning it all. So if we've eliminated 2 of the Power 5 conferences, and if we, let me keep going with this scenario here. Notre Dame gets swept by Clemson and Clemson wins the ACC. Alabama wins the SEC and the East winner ends up with 2 losses. Like Alabama beats the East winner, and whether it's Georgia or Florida, that team ends up with 2 losses. Stu, BYU, maybe? I mean, this also opens up a case for Cincinnati. Maybe you can just throw them in there too. But I mean, are we looking at a game where BYU could conceivably make a case against Boise State that is a lasting case that, hey, we deserve to be in this conversation?
I think that Cincinnati has a better shot at that because this is an important game, obviously, for BYU. And if they beat Boise State and they put on a great show, now they then need Boise State to turn around and have a great season from there and to validate that. But at the end of the day, like, it's this game and possibly the San Diego State game. Nothing, almost all of they're basically playing the equivalent of a Conference USA schedule outside of that, right? It's a lot of games against Troy, Louisiana Tech, UTSA, Texas State, Western Kentucky, North Alabama. You're going to put that resume up against even a 2-loss Florida or Texas A&M. It's just not going to be comparable.
Heck, a 2-loss Big 12 champion
is going to play. Yeah. I mean, they just clobbered an top 25 SMU team, a Memphis team that was just in a New Year's Six bowl. They're going to play UCF, who people have a lot of respect for. Then they're going to play one of those teams again in the conference championship game. that to me is a more compelling case if they're undefeated than BYU.
Yeah, with BYU, it becomes all about the eye test, which, I'm not a big fan of that, quite frankly. I like to kind of look at the metrics myself, and I'm a little more resume. But at a certain point, like they have a big physical offensive line, and here's the thing that really, and again, I don't think BYU is going to make the playoff. Okay, I'll be like, realistically, I don't think BYU is going to make the playoff. But the one thing that they have going for them is they might have the third best quarterback in the country.
Yep.
Yeah, I don't know what that counts for, but they very well might have. And Zach Wilson, he might be the third quarterback taken in the draft. And again, I don't know what it counts for in a playoff, in the playoffs' eyes. I'd be interested to find out if they go undefeated.
Well, I'll tell you this much: I love watching BYU. I mean, I'm looking forward to Pac-12 After Dark, but I'm also going to kind of miss this. I feel like BYU has been playing that 10:30 p.m. ESPN2 game every week all season. But can the committee? You know how it is. Like the chairman, they give him the talking points. He's got to have a definitive reason why this team got selected. And I just think going out there and saying, well, we just love their quarterback is probably not going to be compelling enough case. It's going to have to be they beat X, Y, and Z. And hopefully Boise State turns into that team for them or that opportunity for them. But remember, Boise State's also only going to play, 9 games?
Yeah,
so
yeah, I think it's 9.
I think BYU, we're skipping right over, can BYU make a New Year's Six bowl? Well, and that's
it's
a big deal for them. They haven't done that.
Yeah, let's shift the conversation to the idea of we won't know until after almost Thanksgiving weekend, right? Well, the first weekend, or the week before Thanksgiving, I think is when the first playoff rankings come out. We're still about 2 weeks away from that. So I am really fascinated to find out what the playoff committee does. Because, listen, the AP will always be better to these teams, the non-Power 5 teams. There will still be a ceiling, even with AP voters. At a certain point, they'll pull back and say, okay, we're gonna park you right at 9, or we're gonna park you right at 8. But the playoff committee hasn't even shown that kind of respect to non-Power 5 teams. So I'm really curious to see how that works out, especially in a pandemic year where teams are, not playing that many games.
Do you remember the very first year of this thing? Marshall was got to 10-0 or 11-0. And just like you described, at a certain point, if you're undefeated, you're going to be ranked and you're going to move up the rankings. And they just steadfastly kept them out because they hadn't played anybody. It was a terrible schedule. Mm-hmm. And that was your first sign that okay, they're taking the strength of schedule thing really seriously. So is it possible that by the time you get to that weekend, BYU might be 5th in the AP poll and then the committee comes out and they're 20th? It's not impossible. But it is a weird year. In some ways your guys' poll has become these teams like BYU, like Coastal Carolina, like the teams that started playing early got more time to get in and move up, whereas Boise State's starting from scratch right now. Or if I don't know, Toledo or somebody comes out of the MAC, they just don't have time to catch up to those teams that started right off the bat. But the committee, supposedly, they tell us this every year, starts with a blank piece of paper every week. So they're going to say, if they want to say, we think BYU is, we don't care that they've risen up to 7th in the AP poll. We think based on who they've played, they should only be 19th. They can do that.
Okay, we're gonna finish with this. We're not going to have the deep discussion on Jim Harbaugh that you and and my friend and your friend Bruce Feldman had on the Audible. If you want to go find that, the latest episode of the Audible on Sunday night turned into a deep dive on Jim Harbaugh, and a lot of people are having that conversation these days. I wrote about it in my column and called it the worst loss he's had. However, this is possible redemption week, right? Which sounds crazy because Indiana number 13. Here's the conversation. Okay, we'll pull the curtain back before we let Stu go to our listeners here. So Stu and I had a text conversation along with Bruce because they suggested on the Audible that Indiana might be the second, right? I think you guys said second best team in the Big Ten.
That's what Bruce asked. I kept hedging. I kept saying, what about Wisconsin? They're not playing. But yes, he said, don't you think they're the second best team in the Big Ten?
Yeah.
You did not like that.
Well, which is insane because I'm all about, listen, the win they had against Penn State was tremendous for the program, and they will remember this year forever. No matter what happens at Indiana, this year will always be remembered as the year they beat Penn State with that awesome play by Michael Penix. That is what makes college football great. They also had zero business winning that game and needed 15 different calamities to happen to Penn State to win it. So the rational part of my brain goes, no, that is not the second best team in the Big Ten. However, change my mind, Hoosiers, and beat Michigan this weekend. It's just an interesting matchup here because there really is a lot now. Because I think if Michigan loses to Indiana, now all of a sudden there's a different level of panic that goes into Michigan fandom. I think now you really start wondering, not should we fire Harbaugh, but how can we convince him to leave?
Well, I think that the frustration with Harbaugh up to this point was that they don't win. He win 8 or 9 games a year against kind of unranked teams or low top 25 teams. But then when it gets time to play number 3 Ohio State or whatever, then they fall flat. Alabama in the bowl game last year, those kind of teams. This was a Michigan State team that had just gotten its butt kicked by Rutgers. I don't think that, it was a great moment for Mel Tucker, but I don't think Michigan State is going to turn around and finish 7-2. I think that they were just a better prepared team. They had a great plan. They exploited Michigan's probably biggest weakness in those 2 corners. And so, it's a bit of a Groundhog Day now, like back to the drawing board. We got to get better. It became apparent to me after that Ohio State 62-39 game that things were starting to really trend in the wrong direction for him and that maybe this just wasn't going to happen. And then I think more people came around to that last year. And I think if you're still we're into year 6, if it's not happening by the second week of year 6, it's probably not going to happen.
Yeah, I still think Michigan's going to beat Indiana this weekend. But we'll see.
Well, and Vegas agrees with you. Vegas isn't overreact. They don't like to overreact. And, Michigan's still favored. I thought it was interesting. It was probably most telling, though, that Michigan State, not only didn't get any sort of bounce from that, or if they did, it was kind of minimal. They are a touchdown underdog to an 0-2 Iowa team that just lost at home to Northwestern.
Yeah, Iowa's an interesting one too. We could have a D'Antonio situation at Iowa, right? With Ferentz, maybe we may be coming to the end of the line here with Ferentz.
After what happened this summer,
yeah, that's what I'm saying.
There was some thought that he'll do one more and call it a night, but that wasn't with any thought that maybe they're just going to be really bad.
Right. And that's what happened with D'Antonio too, right? Because there was some things going on off the field, but you sort of figured, well, if he has a pretty good year, maybe, and then the product on the field went sideways, and the two things combined, I think, led to D'Antonio moving aside. And I could see a similar situation where, there was stuff on the field, he could survive that, a bad, or have a bad year on the field, you could survive that. But if the two things sort of combine, all of a sudden it gets you to thinking, maybe I've been here long enough and it's time to move on. Or maybe the people around you sort of convince you that you've been here long enough and it's time to move on. That's a topic for another time, Stu. Stu, we've made it to a week of football where 10 FBS conferences are playing. It's Monday night, so who knows if we're actually going to get all these games played that are on the schedule. Usually Tuesday, Wednesday is when things start falling apart. Period. Yeah. By Thursday, we have a pretty good idea of how many games are getting pushed by the wayside, but we've made it to what looks like, it almost feels like opening day again for me.
Just don't take away BYU Boise. Put those teams in bubble wrap. Don't take that from me. I've been waiting for that for a while.
Stewart Mandel from The Athletic, thanks so much for joining me this week.
Thanks, Ralph.
And now 3 and out. First down. Let's talk different levels of disappointment this year. First off, LSU has to be the most disappointing team in the country. I thought the Tigers might be getting too much credit from pollsters and prognosticators before the season. LSU was preseason number 6. and had lost a ton off of last year's national championship team. But not even I saw this disaster coming. Of course, in a normal season, the Tigers probably could have avoided a losing record by grabbing 3 non-conference victories. But with nothing but SEC teams left on the schedule, including Alabama, Texas A&M, and Florida, it will be tough for the Tigers to break 500. You always have to worry about a team losing interest when it gets off to a bad start in college football, but especially in a season like this with the pandemic and all that goes into keeping the players from getting infected. I'm even more on guard than usual for disappointing teams just packing it in down the stretch. Second down. Here's a different level of disappointment. Before the season, I thought North Carolina was getting a little too much love. The offense was very good, but it seemed like a stretch to me, at least, that the Tar Heels were going to make a jump from quite good in year 1 under Mac Brown to maybe the second best team in the ACC in year 2. Well, that's kind of what happened. UNC often has played like the second best team in the ACC. By our friend Bill Conley's SP Plus ratings, the Heels are number 13 in the country, about 4.5 points behind Notre Dame. But North Carolina has now lost 2 games that it had no business losing, one to Florida State and last weekend to Virginia. There is still time for the Tar Heels to make a run to the ACC title game, and I'm convinced their offense is good enough to maybe put a scare into Clemson. It's weird. I went from being a little skeptical about UNC to now being kind of in on UNC, or at least on UNC's ceiling, but they keep tripping over themselves. This is a much better than 4-2 team, but you are ultimately what your record says you are. And right now, they're 4-2 and unranked. Third down, couple of games that won't get the big screen treatment against the marquee matchups this weekend, but I'm really interested to see how they play out. Nebraska at Northwestern, the Wildcats are 2-0, and the Huskers are coming off of a canceled game against Wisconsin after being beaten badly by Ohio State in the opener. We say this all the time about these once powerful programs trying to get back to relevance. You have to crawl before you can walk. I'll start taking Nebraska seriously again when it can consistently handle what has traditionally been the second tier of the Big Ten West. Now, Northwestern, generally speaking, has played a lot better than a second tier team, but Northwestern still will have second tier talent. And Nebraska needs to figure out a way to consistently beat the teams like Northwestern and Purdue and Illinois who have the second tier talent. If Nebraska is going to prove that it can take a step forward this year 3 under Scott Frost, beating Northwestern is a really good start. Also, Liberty is ranked for the first time ever. But the Flames have played a schedule that makes BYU's look like a relative gauntlet. Let's see how they fare against Virginia Tech this weekend. I wouldn't be surprised if Hugh Freeze's offense gives the Hokies some real problems, but I also wouldn't be surprised if Khalil Herbert and the Hokies run for about 400 yards on Liberty. That's the show for today. I'd like to thank my producer, Sarah McCrory, for making me sound good. You can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts and on Westwood One Podcast. Please subscribe so you do not miss an episode. I'm Ralph Russo, the college football writer with the Associated Press. Thanks for listening, and come back for more next week of the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast.